So welcome everyone to our monthly webinar series organised by the IUCN's UK Education Communications Working Group. My name is Sophie Stenson. I'm the chair of the CEC Working Group and I'll be chairing the webinar tonight. This is actually the fifth in our webinar series so far. Our previous webinars have covered the topics of nature education for sustainability, youth engagement, and the role of zoos in conservation. So if any of these topics sound like they're up your street, you can find the recordings on our website by searching IUCN NCUK on YouTube or searching IUCN NCUK. We're also looking forward to our next webinars where we will host Miles Richardson from the University of Derby to talk about the importance of nature connectedness. And following that, we'll be talking to Laura Soule, who works with the Natural History Museum and the Department for Education on developing our National Nature Education Strategy for the UK. Our members will receive invites via email. So if you're interested in signing up for these free webinars, we'll also share the links on our social media and LinkedIn pages, which you can find by searching IUCN NCUK. So here we go. We're almost up to 70 people now. That's fantastic. Welcome, everyone. Tonight, we're going to be talking about conserving conservationists. So we are so pleased to be hosting Brittany Sawrey, a licensed associate counsellor specialising in conservation trauma, and Jessie, Panazzolo, the founder of Lonely Conservationists and a sustainability education officer. So I have to admit, I'm particularly interested in tonight's talk, as I think this is a topic which really deserves to be spoken about more often. We'll be talking about support for people who work in conservation, and it's worth noting that we may be talking about some sensitive topics, and I'm sure Jessie and Brittany will mention any trigger warnings before their talks. I'll hand over to our expert speakers in a minute, but I hope you will indulge me in sharing a personal example to start us off with. So I first became interested in conservation when I realized that my passion for studying animals might be better suited to zoology than veterinary sciences, mostly for fear that veterinary career would be mostly time spent with animals that were suffering with injuries or diseases and having to make very difficult life or death decisions. And this was a very emotionally based decision for me. And what I didn't consider at the time was that learning about animal behavior, ecology, and conservation, whilst it includes a lot of positive topics, would also include many very emotionally difficult and stressful topics. And regular exposure to these kind of things can result in deteriorating mental health in terms such as eco-anxiety, for example. And I'm sure our speakers will talk a lot more about that in a minute. So I've been incredibly fortunate in my career so far to be able to work across the world, from Borneo to South Africa to Costa Rica, and I've worked in field research and hands-on animal rescue and rehab, managing wildlife sanctuaries, running internships, and these were some of the most exciting and enriching experiences of my life. And whilst I've done some jobs that were very well supported with proper health and safety training, I've also attended jobs and projects which unfortunately were not. And the nature of conservation work often means remote conditions, either poorly paid or completely unpaid, 100% investment in the job with very little work-life balance, where I was regularly expected to work extra unpaid hours, for example. And I found myself in situations where my safety was compromised, my health deteriorated, where I was socially isolated and had no contact with home. So whilst I also recognize my privilege in being able to commit to some of these jobs where many wouldn't have been able to, this further outlines how inaccessible, unjust, and unstable the sector can be. And it doesn't seem like an effective way of supporting conservation work that really needs to be done. So how many times has someone in this audience seen a job posting for an entry-level job, which is full-time, requiring high level of academic and work experience and years of voluntary field experience for, let's say, an £18,000 salary, or been told, if you really care, you'll just do the work. And, you know, no one gets into conservation work to get rich. But sadly, you sometimes get the feeling that this might be exploiting our passion for a subject when the system is not really equitable or fair to us, the animals that we're caring for, or the subjects that we're studying. So what's perhaps more heartbreaking is that many don't feel like they can share these experiences or speak up for fear that they'll lose their jobs, or struggle to find work again after leaving them. I mean, personally, after one job, we even had to start an emotional support group to discuss what had actually happened at that shared workplace. And although I'm sure these experiences aren't exclusive to the conservation field, they seem unfortunately common in this sector. So these experiences have fueled a professional passion of mine to investigate the workforces behind conservation work. Are we dependent on voluntary contributions for conservation? And is this exchange of time and services really fair to volunteers? Is this a stable system to depend on to reach sustainable development goals? Or is this an unstable system that leads to increased inequalities and burnout? If we live in a system that only measures the values of economic monetary growth, for example, and excludes the immense value of protecting or maintaining our environment, then we're not really properly valuing the work that conservationists are doing and not providing enough support. And therefore, this system could just crumble. So how can we have true sustainable governance? So that's my personal interest in these topics. Is something I'm working on as part of my PhD thesis. So if it's something that you work on or care about too, I would love to hear from you. I'm open to getting in touch and starting an open discussion about this as well. So please do reach out on LinkedIn by searching Sophie Stenson, or contacting me via email, and my contact details will be available in the chat as well. So without further ado, let me hand over to our first speaker, Brittany Sawrey, who is a licensed associate counsellor with the Madeira Group, working on a project in vicarious trauma in conservation. She'll be telling us all about the results of her fascinating study, and she's going to share some psychoeducation about trauma and psychological distress and how this affects the conservation sector.
Thanks so much, Sophie.
No.
Let me pull my presentation up. All right, can you see that?
So there we go. Can everyone see that? Great. Thumbs up. There we go. Great.
Well, it's really a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much, Sophie, for that introduction and just for sharing about your work. I found myself going into therapy mode. I was doing some of my therapy faces. So that was really funny for me to observe in myself. I am here in Scottsdale, Arizona. So it is still morning. I'm still working on my coffee, but good evening to the rest of you. And I am going to be talking today about vicarious trauma and conservationists. So as Sophie mentioned, I just want to be cognizant that we are going to be talking about trauma, which vicarious trauma is a portion of trauma. And so if at any point you feel the need to step away or turn your camera off or do something to take care of yourself, please feel free to do that. I'll be sharing a few quotes from my study that talk about things that were traumatic for individuals. And so I just pay attention to yourself and what you need, what feels comfortable to you, and feel free to do what you need. So a little bit more about me, as Sophie introduced me. I recently got married, so we're figuring out the last name situation. So I'm going by Brittany Colson at this moment. And I am a licensed associate counselor at the Madeira Group. We're a private practice in Scottsdale, Arizona, and I work with individuals of any age 14 and above. And I work with a lot of trauma, a lot of individuals that have gone through trauma and are trying to process that. I have a master's in counseling from Arizona State University. And before that, I got my master's in conservation science from Imperial College London under Dr. E.J. Milner-Gulland. And worked with the Durrell Wildlife Conservation Trust and the Whitley Fund for Nature. And before that was a zookeeper in the States for a few years. So while I was getting my master's in counseling, I was doing my trauma courses and working with individuals. And I started to hear more and more about trauma, which a lot of us have heard about, but maybe don't have a good definition for. And there were a couple of pieces that started getting me thinking about what conservationists go through and what they might be experiencing. So I thought it would be helpful for us to first start by talking about trauma. Trauma, put most simply, is something that happens that overwhelms our ability to process. So this looks different for different people, but it's something that our mind and body cannot take in the moment. We flip into survival mode because we have to get through it. But then the way that our mind and body stores that event is not how it stores other memories or experiences. It actually stores it in a different way that makes it really difficult to just get over, as we often try to tell ourselves. So this quote from Bessel van der Kolk, who's one of the foremost experts in trauma, is that unlike other forms of psychological disorders, the core issue in trauma is reality. So with a lot of my clients, we're working on, well, is life really as bad as you think it is? Doing some reality checks, trying to bring them to a more balanced place. But in trauma, this is something that actually happened, that was terrible, that was overwhelming, that was too much for your system. And so we're trying to process reality. And I feel like in conservation, we can really feel that if we're trying to process reality, not some made up issue. And so another quote by van der Kolk is that trauma produces acute physiological changes, including a recalibration of the brain's alarm system, an increase in stress hormone activity, and alterations in the system that filters relevant information from irrelevant. So this is not just an emotional experience. This actually affects our physiology. It affects our memory networks. Trauma is so much more than like having a hard time. Now, connected to that is something called vicarious trauma. And before I read this definition from the ACA, another way to just put it simply is vicarious trauma is what helping professionals experience from sitting with people with trauma. So I experience this with clients when I'm hearing their stories and I'm taking in, not just mentally, not just emotionally, but physiologically, I'm taking in their trauma and I begin to have effects because of what I'm witnessing, what I'm holding witness to. And this definition is the emotional residue of exposure to traumatic stories and experiences of others through work, witnessing fear, pain, and terror that others have experienced, a preoccupation with horrific stories told to the professional. So we talk about this a lot in counseling and social work and emergency services and different healthcare providers that are taking in these traumatic experiences. But as I was doing my coursework, I was thinking about our work in conservation and thinking about how our client of nature, and that could be a habitat, it could be a specific species, but our client of nature is going through so much trauma that we are bearing witness to. We are the ones that are standing on the front lines and watching what is happening. And I began to wonder, is this sector going through vicarious trauma, just like all of these other helping professionals are? So I decided to do a study to find out because I couldn't find anybody else that had talked about this or had studied this before. So really briefly, we did an online survey that assessed the association between psychological distress as measured by depression and anxiety and vicarious trauma in conservationists. We had a little over 600 responses. We had 375 that we could analyze, and we recruited those through listservs, social media, like Lonely Conservationists. So excited to hear Jessie talk because she was hugely instrumental in getting this study into a lot of hands. And then word of mouth. And we had 47 nationalities represented. I can share more of the demographic information. I just took that out for today's kind of more basic presentation. And my three questions were, are conservationists experiencing vicarious trauma? Is this happening? Is this actually being experienced in the field? Is it associated with psychological distress, such as depression and anxiety? And does social support moderate the association between vicarious trauma and psychological distress? So first, are we experiencing vicarious trauma? And the answer was overwhelmingly yes. Of course, this is skewed because people that chose to take this survey likely had more familiarity with trauma or were drawn to participate in the study. But still, 46.2% reported moderate levels of vicarious trauma specifically related to their work. And 47.7% reported severe levels of vicarious trauma. which it was like at the very top of the scale of what could be measured. And I wanted to just share, and this is one of those moments where feel free to step away if talking about some more details is uncomfortable for you, but I wanted to share some of the things that people reported were the events that resulted in vicarious trauma for them. The first one was that nothing I am doing is really making any difference. The decline is so rapid, despite my best efforts. It feels pointless, but I can't walk away from the fight. I want to try harder, but I'm running on empty. I'm sure a lot of us can really resonate with those words. Another event was when people I am trying to protect turn against me. Experiencing sexual harassment and assault, which from this study, I learned through the open response of what have people experienced, I learned is a huge issue in our field that really needs to be looked at, especially during field work. And the last is meeting a man whose family was killed by an elephant just a few days ago. So when we looked at the associations of vicarious trauma that we now know is happening, it is, no surprise, positively associated with symptoms of depression and anxiety. So the higher levels of vicarious trauma that are reported, the higher levels of depression and anxiety are reported. Depression, anxiety, and vicarious trauma are all negatively associated with employment security. And Sophie even touched on this a little bit in discussing her PhD. So with lower employment security, we had higher reported levels of depression, anxiety, and vicarious trauma, and reverse. When someone had a lot of confidence in their employment security, they reported much lower levels of depression, anxiety, and vicarious trauma. And last, and this one is a little bit odd, honestly. Social support did not moderate the association between vicarious trauma and psychological distress. I thought, and based on previous studies, psychological distress or vicarious trauma than psychological distress, just how I conceptualized it. But with higher social support, that association would be weaker. And that is not true. However, social support was negatively associated with all three, with depression, anxiety, and vicarious trauma. So higher social support, lower levels of depression, anxiety, and vicarious trauma. It just didn't play that moderator role that I thought that it would, that we could kind of intervene in the middle of if someone was experiencing vicarious trauma, that shoring up their social support could weaken its association with depression and anxiety. It didn't. But we know that social support is negatively associated with all three of them. So I'm still kind of rolling through, what do we do with that? So not to put it too plainly, but we have a problem, which again, Sophie already outlined a lot. And I know Jessie will talk about some other aspects of this. But conservationists are experiencing vicarious trauma through their work. And I suspect through reading through all of these open response pieces of the survey, that we're also experiencing a lot of direct trauma. So vicarious trauma, watching something else or someone else go through trauma and having responses. Direct trauma being something that is happening to our person, and that is definitely happening in the field as well. And we know that trauma reduces our critical thinking abilities. As I talked about at the beginning, trauma affects our physiology, it affects our neurology. It has such far-reaching effects that make it a lot harder for us to effectively do our jobs. And it's also associated with burnout, which we already struggle with in this field for so many reasons. And trauma is just another piece of that reduces our resiliency, and it reduces our ability to kind of bounce back and be imaginative in our jobs because it's such a drain on our system. If we want to keep people in conservation long-term, which we do because we need their experience and their expertise and their passion, then we need to start addressing the effects of trauma and vicarious trauma, because this is happening across the sector. And I think it's leading to a lot of the burnout that we're seeing, but we're not addressing it yet, which this webinar is a great example of starting the conversation. So some recommendations that I have, and I'll run through these really quickly. I will not tell the story of the goose and the golden egg, but it's a great fable and it's a great reason to take care of your health long-term. So prioritize taking care of yourself. If you burn out, you can't help anybody or anything else. So doing 10% less to make it the marathon is way more important than pushing yourself and burning out quickly. proactively prepare for fieldwork and plan for post-field processing. One of the smaller results in the study that I didn't share in these slides is that the amount of time spent in the field is significantly associated with higher levels of anxiety. And so preparing people and yourself for that fieldwork has a lot of risks associated with it. And then actually processing it afterwards would be really helpful. Begin conversations with your colleagues about mental health. We know that the more that it's talked about openly, the easier it is for people to get help. I see this in my office constantly. Host a webinar or a workshop for your team or organization to learn about trauma like this one. I'm sure there are a lot of different professionals that can help with that, including myself. Approach donors about addressing this issue. I know that we have a lot of constraints on our finances, not just in general, but also in how we can use finances and use donations. Approach donors about helping keep people in the field and keeping them healthy and working long-term. And last, look out for younger conservationists because they seem to be struggling through this study. They had higher levels of depression and anxiety than their older counterparts. And they could use your support and your encouragement. And wow, that went so fast. So any questions? I'm already 2 minutes over.
That was brilliant, Brittany, and I'm sure loads of people found it really interesting to actually hear the statistics behind all of these things that we kind of hear anecdotally if you're in the sector, and to actually get an overview and a number on that, and to hear back about how many people are struggling with some of these topics is so important to talk about. And I mean, especially the week after Mental Health Awareness Week, which kind of just happened to work in with all of our schedules, but it's a good thing, I think, after everyone's kind of being made aware over the last week of all these mental health issues and to be able to talk about it. So I know someone asked in the chat box whether you would like to share your complete study with any of the audience members, if that's available via email, or if you'd like to direct them to a link where it might be available.
I would love to share that once it's written up. So I did this study and I am working on writing it up, and I love research, and I have to work through my own resistance to the difficulty in writing it up. So once it's written up, I will share it far and wide with whoever would like it. And I'm happy to share my preliminary results and what I'm seeing with anybody that wants to see that, but it's still in process of being written up.
Yeah, absolutely. And I can send you, I think, Michelle, if you'd like to send through your contact details or anything like that, we're happy to put you in touch. And we have another question from Juliet. So she said, what do you think should be done to reduce conservation-related trauma and burnout? Big question, I know.
Yes, so that is a really big question because it's systemic. The trauma that conservation professionals are going through, some of it can't be prevented because of our work. It is the nature of our work to bear witness to what is happening. And some of it can through higher levels of fieldwork safety guidelines and higher accountability for what is happening within fieldwork. That's something that just really struck me, of what is happening to people when they're in the field and have no recourse. They have no help. And that should not be happening. And so putting people in situations where they do have help, they do have support, I think would really reduce our levels of some of these incidents that are happening. But I think, Sophie, your work speaks to this as well, of the systemic pieces of how are we supporting conservation professionals. I mean, we look at that employment security statistic and see that we need higher employment security to reduce burnout. But then that gets into, but we don't have the funds for that, but we don't. And so it becomes very systemic. And so some pieces are putting aside time and money to process what has happened, because we're all going to go through trauma as being humans on this planet. We will experience trauma. And so taking steps to address that afterwards is huge. But then also looking systemically at where are these incidents happening and what could we do to reduce their frequency, I think is another huge piece. And the one that stands out to me the most is accountability in fieldwork.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think maybe one thing that's worth mentioning as well, if anyone's in the audience kind of thinking, how can I, look at project and tell whether there's proper kind of support behind it or not. I'm aware that there's a few kind of accreditation services websites that you can go to that will kind of vet projects before they then advertise them. And I think some of these can be fantastic. I would also say from personal experience, definitely try and contact someone that's been to that project before, because anyone that's done these kind of projects is always happy to talk about it. If you find someone that mentions it on LinkedIn, for example, you know, just reach out to them and say, how did you find it? You know, was it really good? Because, you know, in some cases, websites might only share the positive reviews that they get back. So it's a good idea to kind of check with other people, you know, did you feel like there was proper support when you were there? You know, did you have someone that you could go to if there was any kind of questions you had about getting home, or if you had any health concerns? Was there that kind of support there to look after you whilst you were on these projects? But yeah, as you said, it all kind of cycles back together. So, and also I would love to share more information about what I'm doing, but I've literally just started. So I'll be sure to kind of share more information as I go. But if it is of interest to anyone, particularly stuff to do with the workforce, then yeah, please do reach out. Here we go. We've got another question from Emma. So she says, it might be a bit off-piste, but adds to the loneliness. What is the best response to people who just say something dismissive like, oh, change careers, when we talk about emotions and financial insecurity?
You know, it's really funny to be doing this webinar because I'm sitting in my office and I will go to a client right after this. And so it's so hard for me to separate out, like, what would I say to a client when we're sitting in that? And what would I say, like, in general? And so I'm going to have to go with the general. And in general, I think the people that there's two levels. There's people that say just change career because they genuinely don't understand. And so helping them understand, this is what I feel really passionately about. This is what feels most fulfilling for my time. And I'm struggling to understand, how do I put that together with the challenges in this career? So there's people that need to just have more context of, well, why are you in this career then? It would be like if someone works at a sandwich shop and it's terrible, well, just get another job. That's not the situation that's happening. And so giving them greater context for you personally as to why this is the career that I'm choosing, and I'm really struggling with how to navigate it, might help them know how to engage with you more. There are other individuals that response that's coming up for them is actually a discomfort with emotions and financial insecurity. That brings up something in them that says, I don't, just fix it, change something about it. And that's about them. And that's on what I would say their side of the fence when we're talking about boundaries. And that is maybe, likely, someone that is just not going to be able to be a good support in that. And that has some grief associated with it. But discerning the difference between, this person needs to understand more, and this person is uncomfortable with me sharing the emotional challenges and uncomfortable with talking about finances, then they might not be a good person to have as a support. And so seeking out people that do at least have the ability to meet you on that level is a lot, honestly, a lot better use of your time than trying to convince someone that you feel that wall, you feel that push, and you feel that just like, fix it. They should do their own work, but you probably can't get them on your side of the fence. So that's very brief, but.
Yeah, and I think that's a great link. We've got a few more questions, so nobody panic before I go on to talk to Jessie as well. But I was going to say, in that context, you know, having these kind of communication networks with other people that are also passionate about conservation in the same way, that have gone through maybe similar experiences, could be, you know, good people to talk to about these kind of things, and sharing your experiences to people who, you know, are also passionate about the same kind of topics. And I think that really outlines the importance of having those communication options there. So we have Adriana has her hand up for a question, if you'd like to unmute.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah, that's great to hear.
Hi. It's just because I'm finding it so difficult to put my question together. I thought it was best to speak to Brittany directly. Thanks for your introduction, Sophie, which I thought was brilliant, and for the presentation. Is a fascinating research. I work with the human dimensions of reintroductions. So I've got two hats on at the moment. I'm thinking about the practitioners working in the field and experiencing trauma and vicarious trauma, and what kind of support we need to have in place to help the conservationists interact with the people who are experiencing human-wildlife conflict and trauma related to that. I'm asking that because we are writing guidelines or working with communities, working with people in conservation translocations. So I'm thinking about the conservationists and also the work with the local people, because it's something that I never came across any guidance on this subject area, but I think we need to include that in the guidelines.
Yeah. So I'm specifically wondering, like, how as professionals to support the local people that are experiencing trauma, how to talk with them in that, as well as how to support the professionals.
You're being affected yourself by listening to the story, but as a professional, you need to be able to do something as you're listening.
Welcome to therapy.
Can you turn to?
Yeah, that is my day all the time, where I'm like, ooh, I am feeling that. And I'm here for you, and I'm going to deal with that in a second. So I really understand that challenge of, we call it bracketing, where you like feel it come up in you and you set it aside for right now. You have to come back to it. That's the trick. We don't like coming back to it, but set it aside for right now to be able to sit with this person. And again, super briefly and off the cuff, I would say with locals that are going through trauma related to these reintroductions, being able to join them is step one, and being able to actually compassionately be like, I am so sorry that this happened. That is so challenging. Oh my gosh, I can't imagine what it's like to come out and find your livestock killed or something like that. I can only imagine what that's like. Tell me more. To help them feel like you are actually meeting me on my level, not just with words, but you are actually like coming alongside shoulder to shoulder with me to be like, this is so hard. So that would be step one, because people's defenses come down when they genuinely feel like you're trying to understand. And you are actually trying to understand. People can feel the difference. And then second, a really helpful piece is to find common ground of being like, I know you care so much about this land and about this land staying really healthy, about this land being regenerative, about this being here for your kids and your grandkids. And I do too. We're trying to figure out the best way to do that. So can I tell you about, like, this is what's going on for us. This is what we're trying to do. And it's called, so like when we work with parents that are divorced and they're trying to co-parent, we talk about parental intent of, I know you want to be such a good parent, and I know you want to be such a good parent and love your kid well. It's the same kind of concept of like, we want the same thing, but we're trying to figure out how to do that. And so that can be a really helpful, just like a really simple, helpful way to be alongside someone as they're going through it. Then the trick is, again, as you step away, taking this thing that you put to the side and actually processing it yourself with colleagues, with a supervisor, with a friend, with a therapist. I mean, there are a lot of different ways that we can process that vicarious trauma. It's kind of individual, but having that second step of actually going to that. Sorry, I feel like that was a long answer, but that's
it is a long question. I was thinking what kind of resources I need to look into. I hope you will share something that we can point people to, but your answer was very helpful.
Great.
So thanks.
And some of the challenges with this is that we don't have these resources. Yeah. So I'll actually go to the next screen. Please contact me if you want to do collaboration. Jessie and I and a couple other people are out here being like, we need to build resources. We need to do things. We need to help. And it's still in its infancy. And so shoot us all your ideas on what to do on this.
I'll be in touch. Thanks.
Thanks so much.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I was going to say, for any kind of longer questions, anything like that, because we are going to run short on time. I knew there'd be tons of questions. it's fantastic to start up a whole discussion about all of this. If we don't get to all of the questions, then we will have a record of them, and we can always email either one of our speakers after the webinar. The recording will be available, and we'll post the recording with the answers to the questions as well afterwards. As we're getting to 20 minutes too, we want to have time to hear from Jessie as well. So I'm afraid we're going to have to miss a couple of the questions, and we'll hand over to Jessie if that's okay. Thank you so much, Brittany. It was such a great talk, and it's such an incredible project to be hearing about. And I really hope the write-up goes well as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks so much for having me, Sophie.
Thank you. So over to you, Jessie, I guess.
Cool. Thank you so much, Sophie. And can everybody see my screen? Amazing. I was in like this heaven place. Like it was so surreal to be in a webinar where people were talking about conservation trauma and to be acknowledging that there's a problem with conservationists, and even Sophie hearing your story, to have this as a public forum and platform is like all my dreams are coming through. So true. So thank you so much for inviting me to speak, and thank you so much, Brittany, for the amazing work you're doing. I think it's just incredible that we're even having these conversations, and I feel so honored and privileged to be a part of it. So my topic is a bit, my presentation is a bit more personal and less academic, so please bear with me. And also I'm from Australia, but on a holiday in the UK, so the fact that I can't speak is a side effect of the fact that I have holiday brain right now. So please bear with me, but we'll try and get through this together. So my name's Jessie. I'm the founder of Lonely Conservationists, and I'm going to be talking to you about how I help to conserve conservationists and myself. To start off with, I wish to acknowledge and thank First Nations people and their knowledge, wisdom, and practices that exist as the foundation for global conservation efforts. I would also like to pay my respects and really thank elders past, present, and emerging for their efforts in conservation and land management, and acknowledge that when I'm in Australia, I'm living and working on stolen land. I'd like to start off my presentation by introducing you to what my conservation career was like in 2019. We've talked about this a bit in this webinar so far, but here I was on the couch, isolated, burnt out, and about to throw away my whole career in conservation. I was considering becoming a trophy wife. I just didn't know how else I could hack it in the industry. So let's explore what got me to this point. So this was my life before the couch in 2019. I started my conservation journey at age 3 years old when I got handed Sputnik, my stuffed toy gorilla, and I immediately saw similarities in our hands, our faces, our noses and ears. And I asked a lot of questions about primates and monkeys and got really curious and read a lot of books, until when I was 5 years old, I asked my mum the big question: how do I save orangutans? Because I'd learned about all the deforestation and the bushmeat trade and everything that was going on. And when I was a toddler, I wasn't allowed to make a mess and not clean it up. So I couldn't understand why adults everywhere were allowed to make a mess as big as this and not clean it up. So I spent my whole life blinkers on trying to work out the answer to that question: how do I conserve orangutans? So I had blinkers on, as I said. Every decision was trying to get me to that point. I went to an agricultural and horticultural high school where I learned more about land management practices and wildlife and animal behavior and the parts of animals. Then I did an undergraduate degree in biodiversity and conservation, where I traveled at the end of every year in my summer holidays overseas, where I would try and get grassroots conservation experience and understand as many animals and ecosystems and local cultural practices as possible to give me the best bet in being the best conservationist I could be. At age 24, I did my honours degree on the spatial ecology of Sumatran elephants and orangutans, where I was working to answer that question of how do we conserve the orangutan populations. And this is where I worked with locals who were working in oil palm plantations, and basically the organisation I was working for paid the people working at the oil palm plantations to restore the forest instead. And basically my research was so exciting, it found that in just 5 years, orangutans and elephants could both inhabit forest that was planted 5 years before. And in Australia, you start high school at year 8 and you finish at year 12. So if I started high school and planted a tree, by the time that I graduated in year 12, an orangutan could live in that tree. And that just felt so achievable to me. So I was presenting my research at international conferences and I had all these contacts and I was loving my life. But it just couldn't be sustained because as I looked around the restoration site, I saw the mothers educating their children in the nurseries about how to grow new saplings and how to look after them and the diversity of flora and fauna needed to restore a forest. And the husbands that used to be earning money in the oil palm plantations all of a sudden were earning their keep patrolling the forests and protecting the forest. And I looked at myself, a 6-foot white woman in the forest filled with all these tiny brown men. And I was like, I don't think I have a place here long term because I really want conservation to be sustainable. And I think sustainability stems from empowering locals to do the work, to maintain their own spaces and to not only maintain, but foster and have kind of ownership to want their homes to be thriving. So I returned back to Australia and I had to start my whole life again. So I tried a lot of jobs. I was working for koala conservation. I was working in ecotourism. I tried everything to try and start my career again outside of rainforest conservation. But every job I tried had such toxic management. And it was so interesting that before there was questions about how we don't have a union and we don't have HR or higher ups, especially if we're working for such a small family business. And there was 2 jobs I was working at in a row where it was a small family business in a remote isolated area. And I basically had to leave the job because I was getting bullied by the management and I couldn't go any higher up because they owned the organization. There was also, as Brittany and many of the other questions were talking about, financial stress, because no matter what my job was, I wasn't able to pay my bills. So I would have all the stress of a bad culture within the office and all the vicarious trauma of watching the destruction going on around me. And I had a layer on top of that, which was financial stress. And that was all culminating in even more uncomfort and burnout. So my mental health started to suffer with burnout, feeling imposter syndrome because I wasn't valued for my work. So I wasn't getting paid enough. And so maybe I wasn't worth enough to be paid more. And then I eventually realized that I was suffering with PTSD, or post-traumatic stress disorder. When I was lying on that couch that fateful day, wondering if I should give up my career for good, I got a message from my friend who lived in Spain, but I met her researching in Malaysia when she was studying elephants. And she was stuck in Spain and she couldn't get her permits to go back to Malaysia to continue her research. And basically her messages of wanting to get back and feeling stuck made me wonder if I was really the only one feeling this way. So at the time when I felt like the loneliest conservationist in the world, I started a blog where I called it Lonely Conservationists. And I told my story thinking that I was going to give everything up because I had been putting on this facade of perfection this whole time. Because there's so limited jobs, everything's so hard to get into, I felt like I had to be perfect. And I felt like by sharing my truth that I was going to throw away all my opportunities. So I started this blog, Lonely Conservationists, and I told my story. And I never could have imagined that people from all over the world would share their story alongside of mine. And 4 years later, we would have a community more than 6,000 conservationists strong from all over the world, sharing our stories and helping each other. So by starting the blog, I accidentally started a very important conversation as well. So journalists from Mongabay and Australian Geographic started reaching out to do articles. ABC wanted to talk to me on the radio, and a whole heap of people wanted to do podcasts with me. And it was so bizarre having to talk about something that I'd kept inside and stayed silent about for so long. So it was very interesting keeping this angst inside of me because I didn't see anybody else suffering, to all of a sudden everybody wanting to talk to me about it. So I decided to take the conversation further and provide some resources because, as Brittany was mentioning before, there's not a lot of resources for conservationists out there on how to conserve ourselves. It's all about how we can conserve landscapes and animals. So I wrote the book, How to Conserve Conservationists, and I really wanted that to be a how-to guide for us to be able to conserve ourselves. But also, if you're not a conservationist, how can you conserve the conservationists in your life? And it even discusses topics that have come up in the community, such as how do you get into a relationship when you're doing remote fieldwork all the time? Or how do we manage it when we're not working with other humans? What if we're working with conservation dogs? What if we have chronic illnesses? What if we're experiencing racism and sexism and all of the things that we've been mentioning? And I really wanted to compile all the experiences from the blogs that were submitted to the website into a concise guide of all the topics that were coming up. And I also wanted to give some kudos and highlight the voices in my community, all the underdogs and the people that needed more credit. So I also published The Secret Life of Conservationists, which has some of the stories that were submitted in the blog. And I worked with them to make the stories publishable and make sure that their voices are heard. So if people want an insight to the realities of what it's like as a conservationist, they can read The Secret Life of Conservationists. And it's interesting because I've had it's been overwhelmingly positive, the responses to these two books, but I saw a question about what if people don't relate to your suffering in conservation and how do you react to that? And somebody told me that they lent The Secret Life of Conservationists to their friend because they were one of the authors in it, and they were an older white man and he hadn't experienced anything that was mentioned in the book. And that's okay. It's not for you then. It's really to normalize the experiences that people who are suffering are experiencing, because if you don't experience anything and you've had a wonderful life and you've been paid a lot and you've thrived in the industry, that is incredible. But these resources are really for the people who need them. I also wanted to create a podcast as well, just to talk about some of the things in the book, because I know not everybody reads and I want to make this content as accessible as possible. And the first series of the podcast really talks about the book, How to Conserve Conservationists. And the second series the second season talks about some of the things that I didn't mention and some of the struggles of people who are in the community. So it's talking about more struggles than I personally experienced myself as well. But I did that with my co-host, who's also my husband, who is an IT nerd in the tech industry, because I really wanted to have a dynamic discussion about what the struggles of conservation are in a way that is relatable to conservationists, but also addresses the perceptions of the layperson and what they think about the industry from the outside, so we can start having these conversations. So to finish, I really love to talk about how we can conserve conservationists. And I was looking at Brittany's recommendations before and seeing a lot of similarities. So basically, I think it's really important to value individuals for their knowledge and skills. You would never ask a bricklayer to lay bricks for free for 10 years before they get paid to build a house. We have really incredible skills that we have to work hard for and learn a lot for. So we should be valuing people financially for their skills in the sector. And that is by paying them a livable wage. That's super important. We also need to make conservation a more accessible industry, because at the moment it's a bit of a trust fund baby industry. The amount you have to work for free is outrageous and is not accessible for people who are lower socioeconomic in that bracket, or if they have a family they have to feed, or maybe they have a chronic illness and are not able to do field work or even sit at a desk for long periods of time. 1 in 5 Australians have a chronic illness, and the entry-level jobs are always like hard yakka work in the field. So that's just not accessible for everybody. We also need to value the intrinsic needs of people and celebrate when they rest. If somebody tells me that they've taken a nap, I'm so excited for them, because I used to suffer with rest guilt. And I think that this is something we really need to destigmatize and really uplift people for taking control of their rest and well-being and having a sustainable life for themselves. We also need to de-glorify the industry. Some really traumatic incidences of mine have been used as clickbait on a podcast for other people because they involve being chased by tigers or something that seems really outlandish. Whereas for me, this is as life-threatening as being in a motorbike accident. So we really need to treat people's experiences as real and not as this fantastical story just because they might involve things that aren't accessible to a layperson. as Brittany said, we really need to destigmatize mental health impacts and really embrace failure positivity. There's no use reprimanding people or making such a toxic environment for small mistakes. The more that we're embracing failure, talking about failure, it's actually going to help us utilize the really small amount of funding and resources that we have access to. So what is my life like now? I'm not still depressed on a couch. I'm actually helping conservationists through webinars, workshops such as this, managing my community and uplifting them in any way that I can. I finally, at age 30, have a full-time job in the industry, and I don't have to be financially stressed anymore, which is incredible, but it's taken me a long time to get here. And of course, model shoots with birds in my off time. And I'm actually on holiday, as I mentioned, in the UK right now. And today I saw my 99th bird species. So I'm really hoping that tomorrow I can crack that 100 before I head back to Australia. Thank you guys so much for listening. This is how you can contact me and find me on Twitter, Instagram. And please check out Lonely Conservationist if you feel like a lonely conservationist too. And feel free to share your story on the website. Sharing our stories helps to normalize the experiences of others and also me. Yeah, thank you so much for this opportunity. As I said, it's such an honor to be having this conversation in the public, and any questions are more than welcome. So thank you.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much for sharing, Jessie, because I remember the first time I heard about lonely conservationists, and coming from my own personal experiences, it was incredible to hear just that others were sharing these stories. I know there was so much stigma behind sharing the stories and fear behind saying, you know, maybe I haven't had such an incredible experience. And like you said, you know, if it's a story you tell your family and it involves an exotic animal, it suddenly becomes an entertaining story rather than a traumatic story. And I think it's, yeah, it's incredible that you've created this platform for people to talk about it. So absolutely, everyone do go and have a look at Lonely Conservationists. It's a fantastic community, and I'm aware that we're really running short on time, so we're going to try and address as many of the questions as we can. Let me have a look at the chat so far. So, and we will, of course, be sharing the recording with everyone who is registered. We'll send the recording directly to you, and you can contact us as well through the Eventbrite links if you have any questions following the recording. Here we go. I'm scanning through the chat and I can't find anyone specifically. Here we go. If anyone has their hands up as well, feel free to unmute and ask those directly. I'm scanning through, Jessie, because most of the chat is just saying, thank you very much. This is such an interesting chat and things like that. So just finding the actual questions.
No worries. There's a hand up.
Oh, there we go. So Robin?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah, absolutely.
Great. Listen, thank you so much. That's really helpful. And I guess I'm so old. I've worked in the environment movement for nearly 40 years. And the terrible tragedy is, I think at the beginning, maybe it was you, Sophie, or it may have been one of your other excellent speakers, but I think it was that articulation of feeling that one has to keep fighting. But the terrible truth is it's not getting a whole lot better. And there's some really good initiatives around the world. You know, we've pulled some species back from the brink. But, you know, I always get rather frustrated with the WWF ZSL Living Planet report, because actually it's just recording a decline every 2 years. And it would be better called the Dying Planet report. And it's how do you hold in your head and your heart this sense of this, you know, wonderfully biodiverse world, which is still there with us, but actually is deteriorating, and the rest of the world is quite oblivious to it. And, you know, when I started off, we were hopeless hippies in the environment movement. You know, I worked at Friends of the Earth in 1984, I think I started, and there were no environmental science degrees, etc., etc. So there's been some real progress. but it's holding the reality where the trauma comes from, and hanging on to hope, and at the same time wanting to sort of shake our wonderful political leaders and say, do you really understand what's going on? And I think that is the one which eventually burns us all out. And I feel for the younger generation because it's a whole lot harder, and I'm sorry that we failed.
Yeah, it is.
That's a question.
You don't have to apologize on behalf of your whole generation. That's a bit much on your shoulders. But I think what's been really helpful to me is I used to feel the whole world on my shoulders. And I remember growing up and being in school and feeling really misunderstood and not having that eco-literacy at all. Like, even though I was in a farm school and having people surrounded by animals all the time, it was just very like I was fighting everyone to have my voice heard about biodiversity and conservation. But actually, ever since starting Lonely Conservationists, I've realized that there is a person for everything. You can think of the nichest ant species you've ever heard of, and there is a person for that ant. There are millions of people for mammals and reptiles and whole ecosystems. And that's actually made me feel so much better, because a lot of us grow up thinking that the world is on our shoulders, but just acknowledging that there's so many people out there dedicating their lives to specific ecosystems or species has made me realize that it's that division of labor and we're all in this together, and the world's not actually on our shoulders individually. And I think that's what corporations and companies and governments like to make us think, because instead of Coke or Nestle changing their practices, they try to make us recycle when they could change what the bottles are made of, or how they basically, when I lived in Madagascar, we would buy a glass bottle, drink the drink, return it back, they could recycle it. If Coke or Nestle or whatever wanted to do that, they could. Or if Taylor Swift didn't want to take a 30-minute private jet flight to go, like to use basically a lot of people's carbon emissions in a short amount of time, that's also possible. A lot of people like to, a lot of people with positions of power like to put a lot of responsibility on the public because it's their way of getting out of things. But it's a lot of unnecessary pressure on people who are trying their best to have the most eco-conscious life that they can. And it makes me so sad when I talk to university students and they're studying and they're thrifting their clothes and they're trying to be as low consumption as possible, and they're really sad and burnt out. And I have to remind them that it's not on their shoulders, because everybody's telling them that it is. And in some cases, nobody's telling them that it's not. So I think it's really hard for people to read these reports as somebody in the field, because we're trying our best and it seems very depressing. I think a lot of the time conservation messages are marketed towards conservationists when they shouldn't be. They should be marketed towards the layperson, and conservationists shouldn't be continuously hearing that it's on us all the time, because it perpetuates that narrative that we're the ones that have to do something because we've chosen this path. And in Lonely Conservationists, I like to reaffirm people that we're all conservationists. You can be a lawyer and be a conservationist. You can be a teacher and be a conservationist, a mother, a construction worker. You can be literally anybody and be a conservationist. It doesn't have to be your career for you to walk through life having a positive impact for our planet. So I think the way that we talk about whose responsibility is, and the way that we talk about our planet as ours and not use othering terminology like wilderness, where people think they have to go somewhere to be in nature, the more we change our vocabulary and our behavior and the way we communicate with people to make it feel like a shared responsibility and something that we all have vested interest in, I think that's when we'll start to see some change. I hope that helps.
Absolutely. And it's so great to hear from you and Brittany. And I think maybe one of the first steps, it's kind of like that, like processing grief, I guess, is maybe what I'm trying to talk about. The first step is maybe acknowledging that there's an issue and talking about it. And definitely I would encourage everyone to get in touch with Jessie, get in touch with Brittany about the work that they do. They're very open, obviously, to talking about their work and hearing about what other people are doing. And I'm also very keen to hear from anyone that's working in these kind of projects. We've had some fantastic projects, resources, ideas being mentioned in the chat. So we're going to make sure that we save that and that we put everyone in contact with who they've asked to be in contact with. And really, no idea is too small or too silly. Just email us, let us know what you want to get in contact about, and we'd love to hear about it. So unfortunately, we're pretty much out of time. I don't want to keep anyone too far past 7. So if there are any more questions that pop up that you want to type, fit them into the chat ASAP, and we will try and get those emailed through to Jessie or Brittany. And we will send those around either with the recording, or if you want them like privately put in touch as well, then make sure that you mention that. And if you've enjoyed this webinar, please do join us for our next one late in June. We'll be talking about nature connectedness with Miles Richardson from the University of Derby. And details will be released on our socials, and you can also follow us by searching IUCN NCUK or joining as a CEC member for free for email updates. The whole idea of us setting up this Education and Communication Commission as part of the IUCN, it's really a network. All we want to do is put people in contact that want to work on education and communication in these fields. And it's just fantastic to hear about all of the work that everyone is doing. And if everyone knew what everyone was doing, it might be a little bit more efficient. I hope to see you all soon in our future webinars. So thank you so much. And thank you again to Brittany and Jessie for sharing your time and your experiences with us tonight. It's just been fantastic to talk about it.
Thank you so much for having us, Sophie.
Yeah, thank you, Sophie.
Thank you both. Have a lovely evening, everyone.